A very warm welcome to all to this webinar on nature in cities for urban sustainability. I'm Tan Puay Yok from the National Parks Board in Singapore, and I'll be your moderator for this webinar. The topic that we are focusing on today is nature in cities, which is also a happy topic. It's a happy topic because I believe that the large majority of people who live in cities will appreciate the presence of nature in cities in different forms. This can range from roadside trees to parks that are large and small, woodlands, or even protected spaces such as nature reserve, to backyards, home gardens, balcony gardens, and even wildflowers that appear on cracks of pavements. A key question that we should ask, however, is that if nature is sought out and appreciated by urban dwellers, why aren't more cities cloaked in greenery? In fact, recent evidence suggests that most cities in the world do not meet their own targets for greenery provision. The simple answer to this, simple in quotes, right? The simple answer to this is that a city is also a place where there's a perpetual contest for different land needs. The need to have more nature in cities can be crowded out by other singly pressing and urgent needs to meet different functions in cities. The provision of nature in cities is therefore far from simple, and it requires socially determined solutions coupled with technical knowledge and even the economic assessment of policies on land uses. It requires the application of biophysical sciences, social sciences, including economics, for cities to deal with contesting land needs and prioritization of resources. So our distinguished speakers in this webinar will touch on these essential topics. We are very honored to have Professor Mark McDonnell, Professor Jim Chi Yong, Professor Koh Lian Pin, and Dr. Lena Chan to participate in this webinar today. I will introduce them. Before their presentation later. The webinar has a very compact format. Each of our speakers will give a short presentation. After all the presentations, we'll open the floor to receiving questions from the participants. And I've been told that there are more than 500 of us in this webinar today now. I should alert our audience that there might be a lag in the slides because of the live streaming setup we have, and I seek your understanding of this. Our first speaker today is Professor Mark McDonnell. Mark is a towering figure in the field of urban ecology. As a pioneer in the field, he has been instrumental in the very rapid growth of urban ecology over the last 3 decades. And this has in turn made urban ecology a highly relevant scientific discipline to help us think about how we can incorporate nature in cities. And Mark will share the highlights of this topic in his presentation. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Puay Yok. I'd like to move quickly. Oh, good. The 2011 United Nations Global Report on Human Settlements warned that future synergistic interactions between urbanization and a global climate change will threaten the stability of human societies. But in order to reduce this threat requires the incorporation of more ecological principles in the design, construction of cities in the future. So, in the past, our cities have built primarily on principles of engineering, planning, architecture, and design. We now need to move and include more ecological and social science principles when building and retrofitting our cities. Let's define the science of urban ecology. It's the study of spatial temporal patterns, environmental impacts, and the sustainability of urbanization with emphasis on biodiversity, ecosystem processes, and ecosystem services. To create livable, healthy, and resilient cities and villages requires the development of what I talk about as evidence-based city design and planning processes. It also requires us to understand what it means to create a resilient city. Resilient city, or resilience of a city, is the capacity of a system, be it an individual, a forest, a city, or an economy, to deal with change and continue to develop. It is about how humans and nature can use shocks and disturbances like a financial crisis or climate change to spur renewal and innovative thinking. So what is evidence-based design and planning? It's the integration of the best ecological and social research evidence, which is the crux of what is urban ecology, with practical design from architects and planners and designers, and expertise with people's values. Or we need expertise of people telling us what people want, or scientists tell us what people want. There's a tremendous call for ecological information in cities. This is in order to, one, effectively manage natural resources. So we need to reduce air pollution. We need to maintain and enhance water cycles. We need to maintain the integrity of our soil structure and processes. Two, we need to mitigate construction impacts on the environment. This means maintain existing plant and animal communities. Three, we need to conserve and enhance local and regional biodiversity. This means preserve and enhance existing green space. Preserve and enhance our plant and animal species richness, so the diversity of organisms in our environment. We need to maintain food web structure, so all the connections between the plants and the animals and the system in which they live, and also the trophic dynamics, which is actually the energetic connection between all of those different organisms. And we need to prevent what's happening in the world is this biotic homogenization. All the cities are inhabited by the same organisms. We need to maintain local species diversity. Four, we need to provide a diversity of recreational opportunities, which in many just means providing green space. But in order to promote human health, we also need to have clean air and clean water. I encourage my students and I encourage everybody to study many cities. For example, there's no city in the world that does it all. So for transportation and green space, Curitiba, Brazil, is a leading example. If we're looking for livability and resilience, Melbourne, right where I'm speaking from today. Melbourne has been listed as the most livable city in the world for quite a few years. It isn't anymore, but it has been for quite a long time. So healthy cities, Stockholm, just in the last few years, has been ranked the most healthy city to live. And then we're looking at green cover and water management, and I can't think of a better place than Singapore itself. It excels in increasing green cover and managing its water. Also, if we're looking for carbon neutral and green cover, we go to the US. Portland, Oregon is an outstanding example of people who manage carbon neutral and increasing green cover. And then finally, if we're looking toward a bigger old city, a green city and biodiversity, Barcelona, Spain has done an excellent job of improving its greenness and also its biodiversity. So to conclude, we need to create livable, healthy, and resilient cities requires the integration of urban ecology with the practical design and planning expertise, as well as our values. We need to bridge the gap between research, so that's ecological research and planning research, into practice. Thirdly, we need to utilize the knowledge gained from some cities around the world that have successfully created more resilient and livable environments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. Our next speaker is Professor Jim Chi Yong. I cannot think of anyone else who has done more scientific research in the greening of cities than Professor Jim over his illustrious career as a researcher and educator. Professor Jim is affectionately known as Tree Daddy in Hong Kong, and he has expert knowledge on overcoming challenges in incorporating greenery in dense cities like Hong Kong and Singapore. Professor Jim will speak on the challenges and opportunities for incorporating nature in cities. Jim, please.
Okay, thank you. Well, I look at the challenges as well as the opportunities to introduce more nature in cities. For that, we have to, first of all, look at the plight of nature in cities. It's not easy to keep or to introduce more nature in city because it is generally neglected, disturbed, modified, or it sometimes destroyed, and very often considered as inferior or even unsuitable as urban green space. And some people will even consider it as undeveloped or underdeveloped. So it is in general very regimented and if not synthetic. So they have to survive on human terms, simplify, sanitize, contain or tame, or very often manicure excessively. And in many cities, they tend to pave even the natural areas. So in general, you have a very much humanized contents. So how do we tackle these NIC challenges? We have to look at spatial planning. This is very important. Planning for green space have to look at location and geometry. And then we need to take up a pluralistic outlook, meaning that we look at the whole range of representative ecosystems and habitats to make sure that most of the flora and fauna can be accommodated. And then we have to look at the need to take care of a very wide range of clientele, people with different needs, different socio-demographic backgrounds. And we need to look at the issue of environmental equity. And it will be useful to introduce not just nature, but all the package of ecological processes and functions. And then we shall try to make use of nature in city to serve conservation targets. And lastly, we can look at the socio-economic functions, not just the environmental and ecological ones. Now, it is very useful to introduce urban ecological principles in our design for NIC, such as the size and shape. We need to have large patch or wide corridors, long corridors or linear patches, such as greenways and linear parks. And then it will be useful to have long and high quality naturalistic edges. So don't just look at the interior. We should try to borrow the ecotone concept from ecological science, and it will be useful to align the green areas to natural or semi-natural linear features, such as rivers, canals, coastlines, foot slopes, or contour. And it will be good to maximize the interface between land and water, which is very much liked by people. And lastly, we have to pay attention to connectivity. We link the patches and corridors so that users can access them very easily and within a short period. And we can also link the urban areas, the fringes, with the countryside, and then we try to maximize the proximity between the different green sites so that they can serve as stepping stones, not just for people, but for wildlife. And then we can adopt landscape ecological principles. For this, I don't need to go into the details. We look at not only the patches, we also look at the corridor, the matrix, the edges, and then we try to knit them together into a kind of network and then to maximize the connectivity. And we try to make the best use of opportunities to introduce more greenways and blueways. And it is important to make sure that they have easy access. They should be proximal to where people live. And then we can link the natural areas with the countryside. And then most importantly, the green infrastructure and the gray infrastructure should be synergized, should be intimately integrated. It will be useful to enhance the NIC features, the functions, by providing a wide range of habitats, wide range of ecosystems, ranging from natural to semi-natural, ruderal to emulated or created natural, and then let's not forget about the agricultural enclaves, which may be embedded within the urban areas. So it will be useful to have a wide range of representative regional ecosystems, including the terrestrial ones, the aquatic ones, and then don't forget about the ecotones between them. And we shall try to design for native communities to make sure that the native flora and fauna can flourish in the natural areas. And it would be nice to have a very effective wilding or rewilding techniques to make sure that these people can maximize the amount of nature in cities. We shall try to protect and nurture existing natural areas. For example, if we have existing ones, we should rescue them to make sure that they can be embedded within the new urban areas. If there are existing ones that are disturbed or are not very natural in terms of contents, we can try to repair or restore them. And if we don't have enough natural areas, we can always nurture them and create them. So in the new urban areas, it is particularly important to respect pre-urbanization nature so that they can be inherited by the new urban residents. And we should avoid the clean slate mentality, wipe out everything, and then try to recreate something that are poor emulation of nature. And then we shall try to be nature sympathetic. And if it is possible, we zone the high quality natural areas as green spaces and preserve the green fingers. We can learn from the international best practice, and I can cite the example of Berlin's biotop area factor, BAF, to maximize NIC in terms of area and function. Or for example, they have a very good ordinance called Sealed Surface Mitigation Ordinance. They want to get rid of most of the sealed surfaces as far as possible and convert the impermeable surfaces to the permeable form. And then they try to maximize the green cover in the so-called three-dimensional greening mode, making very good use of green roof and green wall, those green spaces above the ground. And then they try to maximize the biomass. So it's not just covering the land with vegetation. They try to maximize the leaf area index, the biomass structure. For example, woodlands are always better than scattered trees, better than shrubs, better than herbs, and better than grass. So they have a gradation and they try to maximize the biomass. And they, of course, they always try to connect and they advocate this so-called 15-minute walking distance to residents. And even for temporary greening, they would not give up, right? So I would say that socioeconomic benefits should also be considered in order that we can engage the citizens, right? So I would maximize the nurturing of a meritorious system and then try to institute policy to ensure that NIC can exist well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. Our next speaker is Professor Koh Lian Pin, who has recently returned to Singapore after very highly successful careers in Switzerland, Australia, and the United States. Professor Koh heads the Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions and will soon head the Tropical Marine Science Institute at the National University of Singapore. A world-renowned conservation scientist, Professor Koh will speak on the topic of nature-based climate solutions and its relationship to the green economy. Lian Pin, please.
Thanks very much, Puay Yok. Very good morning, everyone. I think top of mind for many of us here today is climate change. Earlier this year, the Singapore Parliament declared that climate change is a global emergency, also declared a slew of other green transformation and green growth strategies as part of the Singapore Green Plan 2030. Following that, the government also announced that Sentosa, one of Singapore's most famous tourist attractions, will become carbon neutral by 2030. And just a few weeks ago, Singapore Airlines pledged to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. So clearly, Singapore is very serious in taking a whole of nation approach to addressing climate change by committing to these bold and ambitious climate actions and targets. However, given the very short runway ahead of us, meeting these goals will not be easy. Thankfully, Singapore is not alone because at the global level, we also need to achieve net zero emissions by around mid-century if we are to meet the target of the Paris Climate Agreement. So to help us get started, we can look to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. And this is one of the IPCC's mitigation pathways. For the world to achieve net zero by mid-century, we will have to peak our emissions by 2021, followed by rapid decarbonization, which is the gray part of the pathway. But more importantly, we also need to act on the brown part of the pathway. The brown part above the zero line represents opportunities over the next 10 years to reduce emissions, mainly by avoiding deforestation. And the brown part below the zero line are opportunities for us to remove emissions, mainly by reforestation or rehabilitating our degraded ecosystems. And together, these are the so-called nature-based climate solutions. So nature-based solutions are important, but exactly how important are they for addressing our climate change problem? In other words, what is the scale of the solution versus the scale of the problem? We know that global carbon emissions is currently at about 40 billion tons of CO2 per year. And here I've also included the annual emissions of China, the United States, Indonesia, and Singapore, just for comparison. Recent research from our center at NUS shows that by protecting threatened forests across the tropics, we can avoid the loss of almost 2 billion tons of CO2 per year. And this is greater than the emissions of Indonesia and Singapore combined. If we focus on just the urban environment, our research shows that across about 7,600 cities worldwide, there are almost 11 million hectares of green spaces in urban areas that could potentially be available for reforestation. And if we reforest these green spaces, they could contribute to carbon sequestration at a rate of about 80 million tons of CO2 per year at the global level. So the take-home message here is forest protection and reforestation, including in cities, are an important part of our climate change mitigation strategy. Now, from the perspective of a policymaker or investor, it may not be enough to know what that potential is. They also need to know where the potential lies. And so we also produced a carbon prospecting map to show where in the world can one invest in forest protection to avoid carbon emissions. As you can see on this map, much of the potential lies in South America and Southeast Asia. In fact, Indonesia and Malaysia are among the top 5 countries in the world where we can avoid the most emissions by protecting their forests. If we zoom in and look specifically at cities, we find that not all cities would benefit equally from the reforestation of their green spaces. In fact, cities with the greatest carbon sequestration potential are concentrated in the tropics, especially in Central and South America, coastal West Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. Another interesting finding from our study is that although the climate change mitigation potential of urban reforestation may be limited at the global level, urban reforestation can be particularly important for some cities. For example, we find that for about 1,200 cities worldwide, the reforestation of their available green spaces can offset more than 25%, a quarter of the city's local carbon emissions. Now, nature-based solutions in general are important, not just for carbon storage and sequestration, but also for the multiple co-benefits they deliver to society, including biodiversity conservation, water purification, safeguarding food security, flood regulation, and so on. Another piece of ongoing research at our center is focused on mapping these various co-benefits of nature-based solutions across Southeast Asia to better inform climate and land use policies and decisions. And of course, green spaces in cities also provide multiple co-benefits, including conserving wildlife, maintaining our physical and mental well-being, improving social cohesion, as well as reducing our exposure to air pollutants, noise, and heat. It is partly because of the many co-benefits and benefits of nature-based solutions that carbon credits generated from nature-based projects are a very highly sought after product in the voluntary carbon market today. Given the growing global demand for nature-based carbon credits and offsets, Singapore is positioning itself as a global trading hub for carbon-related services with a focus on nature-based carbon projects and products. Our research at NUS also looked at the financial return on investment from nature-based carbon projects, and we find that Asia Pacific has the highest concentration of the most profitable carbon projects, which can generate return on investment at close to $25 billion every year for the next 30 years. Indonesia alone can generate $10 billion per year, again every year for the next 30 years. So in conclusion, the three take-home messages from my presentation today are as follows. Nature-based solutions contribute significantly to climate change mitigation, especially in the tropical regions of the world, including cities. Additionally, nature-based climate solutions deliver many other co-benefits that are important for both humans and biodiversity. And finally, by positioning Singapore as a carbon services and trading hub, nature-based solutions can also help create green growth opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lian Pin. Our last speaker is Dr. Lena Chan. Lena is the Senior Director of International Biodiversity Conservation at the National Parks Board, Singapore. And Lena has been working tirelessly to promote urban biodiversity conservation in Singapore and other cities for the last 4 decades. She will share with us the key initiatives of Singapore's City in Nature program. Lena, thank you.
Thank you. The previous speakers have actually emphasized on general principles. I hope that this little tale about Singapore restoring nature into the city would show how we have actually implemented many of the general principles. And Prof Koh had mentioned about the climate change aspects and its growing importance, the recognition of the nexus between biodiversity and climate change. And so I hope that, again, Singapore's story will show many of the things we do also try and address climate change. On 16 June 1963, the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew planted a Cretoxylon formosum that seeded the establishment of Singapore as a garden city. After 50 years of manicured greening, Singapore morphed into a city in a garden. Faced with the twin challenges of biodiversity loss and climate change, compounded by COVID-19, Singapore needed to rethink how we can survive sustainably on a long-term basis. In March last year, NParks shared our vision of evolving into a city in nature. It is a truly unique proposition where both nature and people are accorded equal status. To foster a sustainable urban ecosystem and a closer affinity with nature, it is essential to integrate ecology into the urban landscape to create sustainable ecosystems for both nature and people to thrive together and to provide immersive experiences with nature for improved health and well-being. Communities of stewards must be nurtured to help us along this journey. City in Nature is a new paradigm shift, restoring nature back into the city for livability, sustainability, and well-being through the application of nature-based solutions to achieve climate resilience, ecological resilience, and social resilience. City in Nature forms one of the key components of the Singapore Green Plan that was announced on 10th February this year. The Singapore Green Plan is helmed by 5 ministries: Education, National Development, Trade and Industry, Transport, and Sustainability and Environment, demonstrating a whole of government multi-sectorial approach that mainstreams biodiversity conservation. The key strategies that have been adopted to transform Singapore into a city in nature are, firstly, extension of our natural capital. Professor Partha Dasgupta in the Economics of Biodiversity, the Dasgupta Review, forces us to rethink the meaning and significance of natural capital. We also need to intensify our nature in our gardens and parks, restore nature into the urban landscape, and strengthen connectivity between our green spaces. Underpinning these 4 strategies is the increasing recognition that everyone has a role to play, and the success of city in nature hinges on strong support by the advancement of digitalization, science and technology, and capacity in the industrial sector. Let me just share with you why we must conserve our natural capital. Our crown jewel is a central core comprising, the crown jewel here, comprising Bukit Timah Nature Reserve and Central Catchment Nature Reserve that harbor a diversity of ecosystems like lowland dipracarp forests, secondary forests, freshwater swarms, and streams. Bukit Timah Nature Reserve occupies a mere 0.2% of Singapore's area, but it's home to 55% of our native flora species and 84% of the native amphibian species. Our natural capital is further extended by establishing nature parks, back please, that acts as buffer for our nature reserves. Next, please. Our conservation policies are guided by sound science. Through biodiversity surveys, we discovered that several ecosystems exist in Singapore. Translating this to policy, we strive to legally protect representative sites of key ecosystems. With the extension of our natural capital to the northern part of Singapore, we added key ecosystems that were previously not found in the protected areas network. In recognition of the importance of Sungai Buloh Wetland Reserve as a site for migratory birds, NParks secured a stretch of mangroves and intertidal mudflats stretching from Lim Chu Kang Nature Park to the west, right across to Mandai Mangrove and Mudflat Nature Park to the central part. So detailed scientific studies on the biodiversity and physical characteristics of Mandai Mangrove and Mudflat Nature Park were carried out to demonstrate conclusively its complementarity with Sungai Buloh Wetland Reserve. And Kranji Marshes Nature Park to the south adds bountiful habitats for birds. Next, please. The naturalization of a river that runs through Bishan Ang Mo Kio Park is an example of how nature-based solutions can help mitigate floods as well as restore ecosystem services. A concrete drain, like this one here, as before the naturalization, serves only one function of flood amelioration, but a naturalized waterway provides several free ecosystems, including habitats for biodiversity, recreation, outdoor classrooms, flood amelioration, as well as reduction of the impact of drought. Even the smooth-coated otter population, lovingly called Bishan 10, has increased with the naturalization of the waterway. Next, please. The construction of the Bukit Timah Expressway, that's like an 8-lane expressway, separated Bukit Timah Nature Reserve on the left here from the Central Catchment Nature Reserve on the right. Now, some form of ecological connectivity was reinstated with the building of the Eco-Link, known as Eco-Link at BKE. Now, it was just unvegetated, and we planted it, and within like 5-6 years, you can see lush greenery. Thank goodness for us being in the tropics. Now, monitoring has shown that the Eco-Link at BKE is well used by pangolins, birds, and small mammals. Next, please. It is inevitable that infrastructure in urban areas fragment ecosystems. Problems can be turned to solutions if we plant biodiversity into these structures. Excuse my pun, hence strengthening connectivity between our green spaces. Here are 2 examples. The nature ways are roadsides planted with native trees. This mimics the tropical rainforest with multi-layering of plants, creating different niches for birds, butterflies, amphibians, and reptiles. Another important ecological corridor is the Park Connector Network, PCN. Is an island-wide greenery network that connects parks, nature areas, and open spaces. The PCN is well used and well loved by pedestrians, joggers, cyclists, both young and old. Next, please. The biophilic community has grown in its inclusiveness with community in bloom, community in nature, friends of the park, greening of schools or biodiversity. Families, citizens, scientists, and schools partake in numerous programs, and corporate donors not only donate money, but the staff join as volunteers. Just a few more slides, two more. Yeah, for you. Many of activities involve multi-generation participants. Now, next please. Everyone has a role to play. The Parks, Friends of Parks program contribute ideas to park development spanning the entire life cycle. Lastly, but not least, next please. The 1 million trees movement helps connect more ecological green spaces in the next 10 years, paving the journey for Singapore to evolve seamlessly into a city in nature, embedded in biodiversity, and entrenched in climate resilience, ecological resilience, and social resilience, with everyone playing their part. Thank you. Thank you, Puay Yok, for indulgence.
Thank you, Lena. Your enthusiasm in urban biodiversity conservation clearly showed in your presentation. I'd like to thank all the speakers for trying their best and indeed having achieved that, keeping to the time they've allocated. We'll next move on. I will invite all the speakers to turn on the video. We'll next move on to the question and answer session and to have a discussion among the members. But before I do that, I thought I could highlight a few key takeaway messages that I've gathered from the presentation. So from Mark's presentation, the take-home message to me is that there's still a need to bridge the gap between research and practice. And I think a lot of scientists are acutely aware that the work that we do in the academic settings should be maximized and applied to practice and policy making. That's my first take-home message. Second one from Jim's presentation is that there is a lot of opportunity to achieve multifunctional landscapes within urban settings. Right? So if buildings are in the way, we can try our best to green up the roofs and the vertical facades. Transport infrastructure can be green up. Similarly, there's a big movement now in many cities in the world to green up drainage infrastructure in the form of water-sensitive urban design. From Lian Pin's presentation, I think I become even more convinced, as with other themes have been shared in the World City Summit sessions, that cities is not just a problem. Cities can be part of the solutions towards climate change. And the potential to use urban vegetation to offset carbon emissions of cities can be a big way to move forward. From Lena's presentation, I think we are, as a colleague, I'm very familiar with what NParks is doing. But I think the key message for me is that it is promising and it can yield many benefits to look at the city in terms of its biodiversity as being half full or half empty. Now, Singapore has clearly chosen to take a half full approach, to be positive about recognizing that we have lost a lot in the past, but the future action should be taking a more positive tone about what we can do going forward, rather than to hark back on the past. Yeah. So with that, let me scroll to another screen to pick up questions that have come from the audience. And maybe I'll start off with this one. This is from one of our participants who says that, who is asking the question to our speakers, what else should Singapore be focusing on next in the sense of on the area of incorporating nature in cities? The question is directed to Mark, but I guess I can let Mark start first, and Mark is also very familiar with Singapore, and then I'll now invite other speakers to respond to this. So the question, Mark, is what else should Singapore do going forward to incorporate nature in cities?
One of the clear areas that I see in the world, and not just Singapore, Singapore has done a really excellent job. Over a 10-year period, it increased its greenness by some 10%, which is unheard of in cities. But it did that by increasing its parks, but it also did it by greening the urban environment. But that was done with lots of money, because it's, big money real estate, big money green buildings. And one of the things that I would like to see Singapore do is develop some examples where some of the cities in the world that don't have a lot of money can begin to green their urban infrastructure. Thanks, Mark.
Do you have any examples that come to mind about what these lower cost solutions may look like? Yeah.
I think some of it involves common sense, and I know there are some examples in Malaysia and potentially Indonesia where basically we pull back from the standard sort of knock everything down, even if it's not asphalt paved, it's dirt paved. The idea is to try to preserve in any way we can those little gems of nature that still exist in some of our cities. We don't need to be building large structures and putting trees on top. It would be really good to learn how to do it at the human ground level and do it in such a way that these systems, even though they might be a hectare to 5 hectares in size, that would be big, but a hectare in size that we could maintain, a beautiful ecosystem. Like Lena, some of the beautiful ones we have in the central catchment. I mean, can we make smaller ones of those within cities? That's a real challenge.
Thanks, Mark. In fact, we also have a comment on that come from our audience about whether or not we can create a Miyawaki mini forest that is gaining popularity in many cities. I guess there's potential for that. I'll also pose this question to Jim. Jim, you're a keen Singapore watcher and you're highly familiar with what is happening in Hong Kong. Right? For very dense, complex cities like Hong Kong, Singapore, where there's always a competition for land needs, what else should cities like Hong Kong and Singapore do? Yeah.
Well, for Hong Kong and possibly partly for Singapore, because you have done so much already, and I think it would be good to re-establish part of the original tropical forest somewhere. Is it possible to do that? That will be try to get back the primary forest that was originally there before human invasion into the island. So for the Hong Kong case, I would think we can try also to re-establish our so-called subtropical monsoon forest. That would be very nice. In other words, you can take a trip to the genuine forest within a day, possibly. Right, and the other thing I would like to do is not asking Singapore to do more, because you have already done so much, and that is to export your expertise and experience, please, to other countries. I mean, as many countries and many cities are struggling, trying to improve their greenery, trying to improve the nature in city, but they really don't know how to do it so well. So why not be more aggressive in exporting your experience to other places? Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. No, I think it's really a case of sharing knowledge and learning from each other. Yeah, Lena, you raised your hand. Yep, Lena.
Well, if I may just reply to Jim, we have this Singapore Index on cities biodiversity, and that's like an index that helps cities track their biodiversity conservation, but it also gives inspirational targets. So we've been actually working with many cities so that when as they do the indicators, track the indicators, they also know what makes a city green. That's, I hope that would probably, answer your question there. Yeah.
Thanks, Lena. I guess, Lian Pin, having just returned to Singapore, right, and you have also lived in many cities worldwide. Back to the question that I was asking the other speakers, what else should Singapore do in trying to pursue this frontier of incorporating nature in cities?
Thanks, Puay Yok. I think the other speakers have already highlighted the achievements of Singapore in terms of increasing our green spaces on our island, which is quite remarkable, given that there are so many other competing land uses that we have to grapple with. I think moving ahead, one other thing that we could potentially invest in doing more from the research perspective is to understand not just the amount of green spaces that could be added, but also the quality of these green spaces, both new ones to be added and the existing ones. Because I can imagine as we move forward, the competition for the many different priorities of society will only get more intense. And at some point, we will have to triage our green spaces to prioritize the ones that we would like to keep and the ones that we might have to be using for other priorities. And having an idea of the quality of these green spaces in the different ways of measuring them, not just biodiversity, but also climate mitigation and adaptation benefits, human societal benefits. I think having that information would be very important for informing our decisions on land use.
Thank you, Lian Pin. Now, I fully agree with you. In fact, I suggest that we should think that further and involve community in this forum and take in their opinions as well. Because after all, we are dealing with wicked problems, and wicked problems cannot be just solved by technical means. They have to be solved by social means as well. I pick up another question from the audience. And this is the question is as follows. Nature-based solutions have been shown with evidence to be most effective to combat climate change. But what is the main challenge preventing government bodies, organizations, and stakeholders to push for nature-based solutions compared to other types of solutions? And I presume the speaker is asking about traditional engineering solutions. So what prevents government stakeholders from pushing more for nature-based solutions? And I guess I can start off with Lian Pin for him to share his opinion. Yeah.
Thanks, Puay Yok, and thanks to the audience who raised that question. A very good one. There are many different definitions of nature-based solutions. So I will just tackle the one that I am most familiar with, which has to do with either reforestation, urban reforestation, or reforestation in other areas, or protection of standing forests. So these are the kind of nature-based solutions that I'm most familiar with. At the moment, I think one of the main barriers to the uptake of these solutions as a way to offset the emissions of businesses and countries is the lack of certainty and the lack of transparency in the quality of these carbon projects and products in the market today. So that is also why Singapore has plans to establish a carbon exchange in Singapore later this year, which will potentially help increase the price transparency of these forest carbon projects and products, will help to raise the bar in terms of their quality, and also will allow the buyers, including businesses and governments, to assess the suitability, the quality, and the extent to which these nature-based carbon credits and offsets can be used as a way to meet our climate change goals and targets.
Thanks, Linking. So I guess that the key task ahead of us is still presenting information in a clear, transparent way that we can use to communicate with different stakeholders. I could also ask this question, Jim, could you also share on this question that was asked? How should we get government bodies to adopt nature-based solutions compared to some of the traditional engineering solutions that we see in cities?
I guess the nature-based solution has been talked about in many places, but then it seems that the connection between science and policy is not there. And as a result, many governments may talk about it, but they have difficulty or even unwillingness to introduce nature-based solution genuinely into the urban development and management. So I would think that it may be necessary to introduce nature-based solution actually into the planning legislation to make sure that it is followed, it is adhered to, and it is really implemented effectively. And then the other way to make sure that it is properly used to benefit people is to enhance the education, especially the public education of civil servants, to make sure that they understand the importance of nature-based solution, not just to the present generation, but to many future generations of residents. So it will be good to train them. And if necessary, I would think they may need to sit a test to make sure that they understand the concepts and the practice before they are allowed to plan the city. So I may be a little bit harsh, but I think for some communities, for some jurisdiction, you may have to take that path. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. I tend to support that. I think we need to introduce ecological literacy among policymakers as well. I have another question that has come in. I think that is interesting. So this question is there proven evidence that urban greenery in fact reduce urban population stress levels and reduce negative social events like violence? I reckon that probably not everyone here are social scientists, but you must have experienced these topics before. Maybe I'll start off with Lena. So Lena, the question is there proven evidence that urban greenery reduce stress level and reduce negative social events like stress and use of prohibited substances? Yeah. What is the feeling?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Because your sound was very well. Sungai Buloh Wetland Reserve had a program at one time for children. I think it still runs. And basically, those children who had behavioral problems were actually, brought to spend time in Sungai Buloh. And it really altered their behavior. So that's one evidence, that it does help. And second, during COVID-19, it was obvious that when people, during the lockdown period, and people couldn't go anywhere, and that is where Singapore, again, we have this policy of setting parks such that they are either 400 meters away, that our target is actually such that 100% of our population is within 400 meters or 10 minutes walk away from the park. And we're almost achieving that. And it was amazing during COVID-19 at how it helped distress people and how our parks are so busy. Every weekend is just, and public holidays, we have to do SDM duty. So anyway, so just to get, so that is just from the Singapore context, but there are several papers actually out, scientific papers showing how, having greenery around in neighborhoods actually help reduce crime rates. And studies, of course, with the forest bathing, people have taken, all sorts of readings, and they found that it did de-stress people. Thanks.
Thanks, Lena. Mark, could you also add on your opinion on this topic? Whether or not the evidence is strong enough that urban vegetation does reduce stress and reduce socially undesirable behavior?
Well, thanks for asking that question. I have to say that, but certainly I've been involved in urban ecology for, as you mentioned, many 30 years. Jim, you have been too. One of the most enjoyable, if you're not, or satisfying research that I've seen that's now been developing for maybe 10, 15 years has been a critical evaluation of the role of green, whether it be trees or gardens, in urban areas. And I have to say, it was slow. Urban ecology has been slow in developing a science. This has even been slow. I think we're at the very beginning of this. I think it's a huge opportunity for researchers in the future and students. But what we're seeing now is a growing evidence that, for example, even a school that has windows out on green space, those students perform better than in schools that don't. So you don't have to even be in the green space. You just have to be surrounded by it and see it every day. There's numerous examples. In fact, the literature is getting quite big, but I don't know if we've had those seminal papers because they're not getting the funding they should get. But for example, certainly there's a lot of evidence that being in a green environment, people recover more quickly from mental, from traumatic accidents. But having a green space around, calming influence, water, has all been proven to be very beneficial to human health in general. So I think that we're onto something here.
Thank you, Mark. Indeed, having also been involved in some of these studies in Singapore, I can add that there are growing evidence to suggest that vegetation in cities are beneficial for well-being. Now, of course, I should add that this is a complex topic. The level of benefits and the types of benefits, and even when you throw in the issues of equity, the benefits may not be distributed equally across different social demographic groups, and they're also dependent on socio-economic context. We are running out of time, and I should wrap up now. My apologies to all the questions that have come in, which I'm not able to ask. We hope that all the audience have benefited from the sharing by our speakers and the discussion that we have had after the presentation. I also want to thank the audience and the speakers once again for participating in this webinar. So goodbye from Singapore. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.